Hello and welcome to the Dynasty Vipers Vipercast Man versus Model Fantasy Rookie Edition here. Joining me as always, the one and only Miss Fantasy herself, Tera Roberts, and from Fantasy Points, he is the master of the Dank Stat himself. He is the one and only Scott Barrett. How you doing, Scott?
I'm good. Thanks for having me back, guys.
It has been a while. What's been like a year and a half, give or take? I think last time you were on was on Behind the Grind. And that was like one of our first ones. I think it was like back in season 1 or season 2, somewhere like that. So it's been a while, but we got rookies that we need to talk about. The rookie draft just took place there. The NFL, some of the biggest names are coming into the place. And there's a lot of questions about a lot of these players there, Scott. I don't know about you. There's the wide receivers that we all feel pretty good about. And then there's a couple quarterbacks. There's some running backs that really got murky. Isn't it every year, though, the running back position, we feel like, hey, you know what? There's some good running backs, and then it gets really murky when we look at these landing spots. I don't know if you feel the same about it, but I feel pretty good about a certain rookie running back, and you see where they land, you're like, yeah, I'm out.
Yeah, this one was easy for me. I kind of really only liked 2 running backs, and then there was a third maybe I can get excited about with the landing spot. But yeah, my RB1, Jonathan Brooks, I think went to an amazing landing spot. We all saw what Dave Canales did with Rachaad White last year. Expect him to be a 3-down back for them, which is important because, you know, they're going to be trailing a lot. So rather than be negatively impacted by negative game script, you know, when they're trailing, they're just going to pepper him with check downs and he'll get that PPR cheat code upside. And then Trey Benson, another player I liked a lot. Arizona, I don't think is a great landing spot in the short term with James Conner there. I don't know that he leads that backfield in snaps or carries, but in the long term has to be nice. If you look at all teams last year ranked by yards per carry, Miami was first, no surprise. You know, just Mike McDaniel's a genius and Devon A-Chain went ham. But right behind them and closer to Miami than any other team was Arizona. And so looks to be a great landing spot for an early down workhorse such as Trey Benson. And I expect that team to take a nice step forward this year. And then third for me was Blake Corum, where to me kind of looked like a richer man's Alexander Madison. I don't know that he's an RB1, but he's like a really good RB2 with 3-down potential. And that's just kind of like exactly the landing spot. He's going to be the RB2, but I think I said this in my write-up, like, you know, the RB1 goes down, he's going to have some DFS winning weeks. And it's like, yeah, Kyler, if the RB1 there goes down, he's going to go nuclear. And, you know, that's the case with Sean McVay running backs. As we know, he likes a bell cow.
And you mentioned Kyren Williams isn't exactly a healthy running back. I think he missed like 4 games last year. He still finished like RB5 in fantasy because of what he was able to do on a per game basis. Both Kyren Williams, he was one of those bell cow backs, which is a dying breed out there with all the touches he was getting. Blake Corum's proven that he can handle the load. What he was doing in Michigan, I think he was averaging, I want to say about 500 touches, about 2,700 yards the last 2 seasons there in Michigan. So you know he can carry the load. Jonathan Brooks, you mentioned Carolina as a landing spot. That was one of those sneaky good spots for any running back to possibly land at. You felt, hey, if a running back goes there, this is a guy that you could feel good about because not only the Dave Canales type factor, but there's no commitment to Chuba Hubbard, who's from my neck of the woods here in Canada, and Miles Sanders, who they brought in via free agency last season, who really did nothing. So there's no commitment to the Panthers, to those running backs, or at least to this new coaching staff coming in. This is Dave Canales' guy, and he has a lot of rapport with what they're going to do there. And then with Trey Benson, he kind of does remind me of a James Conner type running back where he can run between the tackles. He can play in the passing game. So basically the Cardinals got themselves the newest version of James Conner, maybe one that's a little bit more durable. And we know that the Arizona Cardinals, they only passed the ball 54% of the time last season, which was in the middle of the pack. So you know Benson's going to have an opportunity to run the ball a little bit. So Tara, when you look at these 3 running backs, 1, 2, and 3, are you right there with Scott about how they rank?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, the easy one is Jonathan Brooks. I was crossing my fingers and praying that it was Dallas. Ended up not being it, obviously, since Jerry Jones has tipped his hand a little bit there. But Carolina is a good landing spot. I was on the side of Chuba Hubbard, but excited that Jonathan Brooks is going to go there and have the RB1 opportunity. I was also happy to see here in Scott's rank that he is on the same wavelength as me as far as Blake Corum. I know there's a lot of people that are kind of feeling like, hey, we've got, these 3-day running backs. You can't trust them to retain their roles. They have a fantastic season or lead their team in carries, and all of a sudden they fall off and get replaced by somebody else that gets better draft capital. So instinct, I feel like for a lot of people, is to look at Blake Corum and somehow think that he's taking over there. But from what we're hearing, and when you look at what Kyron Williams did last year, there's no logical reason that he's going to lose the job. Injury issues, workload was insane. They have to have another running back there that they can rely on. It sounds like they really like him to fit that backup role. So I like that. I like that ranking there for Blake Corum. A good high-end handcuff, somebody that you can draft because, there is injury risk there, but not somebody who we're valuing the same that we would a Trey Benson.
And then Scott, I know if you guys want to catch all of Scott's rankings, he's got his 1QB and his Superflex over at fantasypoints.com. Catch that right now. But 2 of these running backs are worth drafting in the first round of fantasy drafts. Something that maybe before the draft took place wasn't necessarily going to happen. I don't know about you, Scott, but when I looked at this running back class versus wide receiver class, I wasn't necessarily leaning towards a running back in the first round, but we talked about Jonathan Brooks, that landing spot. We talked about Trey Benson in that landing spot. These are 2 running backs that are now in your first round. Were they there before the draft?
I think Brooks was there. Benson early round 2, where it's just, you run it's not going to happen, but what if the Eagles take Trey Benson and he's behind Saquon and it's just, he's dead. So you have that risk there. I was a little less worried about, Jonathan Brooks, just because he was the projected RB1. He has that 3-down skill set. And, there were some key landing spots. We didn't see the Chargers draft anyone early. We didn't see Dallas draft anyone, but they had that upside. And so, that's a key component to it. I think just due to positional scarcity, there's going to be a lot of RB needy teams in your rookie draft. Both guys belong round 1 in a 1 QB league in a super flex. Only Jonathan Brooks, just because, it's hard to find those studs, especially now after this class, which doesn't look great. And then in the later rounds, I have guys I'm excited about, but, I'm probably not taking Lloyd or Wright or, bunch of these guys at their cost. Tyrone Tracy is someone I like above cost. Estime above cost, but Corum, Lloyd, and Wright are all in that high end round 3, low end round 2 range. Fringe round 2. Yeah.
As I say, Tyrone Tracy is one of those guys that really kind of flew under the radar when it comes to the masses, so to speak. You didn't see a whole lot of his name being mentioned out there until you got into that inner circle. I know over at Fantasy Points, we talked about him a lot in the group chats and on the Discord channel and all this other stuff. Going to the New York Giants is kind of like the perfect spot for him, really, because there's nothing else there. Who's going to challenge Tyrone Tracy for these touches, really? I mean, they brought some bodies in, but they're not exactly those guys that are going to really scare you off. I mean, you look at your ranking for him, back end of the second, early 3rd round. I feel that's a good value for Tracy there. Just kind of talk about some of the things when you looked at his model, what kind of popped for him?
Yeah, it was definitely the upside. So he was a converted wide receiver, and in his second season, he led Iowa in yards per route run, above a wide receiver who got drafted day 3 the next year, above Sam Laporta, although I think Laporta was a freshman at the time. And that's what we want. We want pass catching running backs with pass catching upside. Targets are worth 2.5 times as much as a carry in PPR leagues. And then, so what can he do on the ground? Well, the guy had I think 33 carries in his career, maybe never more than 17 in any season heading into last year. And then he ranked top 3 in yards after contact per attempt, top 3 in missed tackles forced per attempt. And if he puts it all together, he's a really high level athlete. He's inexperienced for the position, but impressed as a runner. And then he has that pass catching skill set. It's maybe he could be Antonio Gibson. Better yet, maybe he could be like prime David Johnson, who was breaking leagues prior to injury. And so I'm, Mr. Upside. So I'm going to gravitate towards that. I'm going to chase that. As for the landing spot, yeah, they have Devin Singletary, who I've always maintained is just a guy. The best thing he has going for him is he is very versatile, more of a complete running back who brings an element on the ground and through the air. And Tracy, I think, just has like exponentially more upside. So if he comes into training camp and impresses, who's to say he can't just do that Devin Singletary role at a much higher level, become the bell cow, and eventually a couple years down the road become like a fantasy superstar. That's low probability, but it's possible, and it's something I want to be gambling on.
I want to ask you both this, Tara. When you look at the draft and the landing spots compared to maybe your original rankings, who was the biggest winner and the biggest bust or loser, so to speak, there when it comes to the running back position?
I'll do biggest winner first. And I want to get Scott's opinion on this one. Audric Estime in Denver. I don't want to talk about Denver, but I feel like we have to. I feel an obligation to talk about it. Javonte Williams, obviously early season, coming off of that injury, took a while for him to get into the swing of things. But even when he got into the swing of things, there was nothing wildly impressive. We still had multiple backs being used, and Samaje Perine and Jalen McLaughlin. And when you're looking at that backfield, I honestly, even though I like Javonte, obviously coming out of college, I don't feel like anyone has a stronghold on it. I don't feel like he has a stronghold on it. And Audric Estime obviously fell dramatically as things turned out with the combine. But hey, he got a good landing spot. Maybe, it's not unprecedented for somebody to come back after, a bad combine and turn things around. So that's a winner for me. Scott, for you, was that somebody that you moved up based off the landing spot?
I'm sorry, who was that?
Audric Estime.
Yeah. I don't know that I moved him up for the landing spot. It was more just I was convicted in the player. I had him as my RB5. I really liked him. And it was interesting listening to the Denver Broncos presser, where they said a lot of the same things I said. They referenced the stats I was referencing: yards after contact per attempt, explosive play percentage, etc. And the way Sean Payton described him was exactly how I just like. Every guy has a type, right? Some like him small, some like him big, some like him thick. I like my running backs thick. I like them able to withstand a robust workload. I like good lateral agility for their size. And I just don't care so much about top end speed. And that's like Estime to a T. That's kind of how Sean Payton described him as well. And I think there's a lot of question marks with Javonte Williams. I think, is he going to be who he was last year, or could he return to pre-injury form? And I think those are questions the Denver Broncos are asking themselves. And so if he is who he was last year, I think that's a great opportunity for Estime. And we know Sean Payton's track record with running backs is insane. He typically opts for a committee, but if you look back over his last, 15 seasons as a head coach, his running backs have combined to finish top 3 among all teams in PPR fantasy points in like 93% of those seasons. So good landing spot, I'd say. It was also a player I liked. And so I guess the landing spot probably offset the lower draft capital. And I just reverted back to where I initially had him in my rankings.
I want to talk about 2 running backs. I have my biggest loser. I'm going to start with this first because I was very high on Braylon Allen from the get-go. I have a type 2. I love the big back. I don't feel bad about saying this. I like a big back. Braylon Allen is that big back. I love how he broke out. I loved his age. I loved a lot of things about him. Apparently, the NFL did not feel the same way about my love for him as well. And I think in your original rookie model, he came in about RB7. The New York Jets, there's Breece Hall. You're not going to take any touches away from Breece Hall. So this one really hurt me. I want to just talk about Braylon Allen here just a little bit. Why do you think he kind of dropped off a lot compared to, I think a lot of people felt good about him. Maybe not like RB1 or RB2 or RB3, but he dropped a lot in the fourth round. Not terrible draft capital, but I had a lot higher hopes for him entering the draft this season.
Yeah, well, I think a big reason Estime fell was because the combine was really bad. He did make up some ground at his pro day. By my metrics, sports score, if you count the pro day and not the combine, he's a perfectly average athlete. I think the NFL looks at it differently than I do, but they tend to overvalue 40-yard dash and not speed score and some other stuff. I think they might be doing wrong, but yeah, perfectly average for me. And then with Braylon Allen, my analytics profile on him was like, not really a fan, but he's arguably there's like not too much of a difference here between what he did versus what Corum did. Although, Corum had the injury and some other stuff, but what really hurt him, I think both in my rankings and then ultimately in the draft was he chose not to run the 40-yard dash either at the combine and his pro day. And so like chances are he was going to run a really bad time. And I think that matters a lot to NFL teams where if you just like run below above a certain number, you're just off their board. And I think teams were kind of smart enough to, listen, this guy would probably run one of those times. Let's push him down. But yeah, now with this landing spot, I mean, I have no interest in him.
But one running back that I do have interest in now is Kamani Vidal there, going to the Los Angeles Chargers, a guy who wasn't really maybe in a lot of top 10s. He may find himself as a great value, maybe mid-third round type value in fantasy drafts. I know he wasn't in your original rookie model, but is this a guy that kind of moved up in your rankings here after the draft?
Yeah, I'll tell you why he wasn't in my model. So my model has a major bias against small school prospects. And I think it's totally justified in having that bias. Like the track record is horrible. And it doesn't even look all that predictive where like you could have a Darrell Henderson who is like multiple standard of deviations better analytically than any other group of 5 running back. And, he's still no better than Kareem Hunt or Devin Singletary or any of these other group of 5 running backs, Zach Moss. So like my model basically treats the Big Ten and the SEC like the majors, all other Power 5 programs as AAA, group of 5 as like single A, and then FCS as whatever league the Savannah Bananas play in, right? So major bias. And so like I see on Twitter, like people putting out, oh, look at Kamani Vidal's numbers versus Braylon Allen, or look at it next to Jalen Wright. You can't do that. You just can't compare group of 5 to Power 5. And if you look at his numbers within the group of 5, it's not that impressive to me. It's like slightly above average, but Tajay Spears blows him out of the water. And I wasn't high on Tajay Spears. Frank Gore Jr., I have no interest in, was better by every key stat that matters to me. And so I just don't think this is a high level prospect. And like based on the draft capital, it doesn't look like the Chargers think this is a high level prospect either. The flip side, however, is we know this is going to be one of the most run heavy offenses in football. They're probably going to win some games and score some touchdowns. And the backfield competition is super low. So like stranger things have happened. And ultimately for me, I put him, I guess like in a tight tier with like a bunch of guys I don't know what to do with. Ray Davis was the top running back at 31, and then Luke McCaffrey, Kamani Vidal, Jatavian Sanders, Michael Penix Jr., Theo Johnson, all in a 1 QB league.
Well, let's translate over to the quarterback position because you did mention Michael Penix's name in that. He may have been the biggest loser in the immediate as far as quarterback position. I mean, that's a horrible spot to go to for the now. I get why the Atlanta Falcons may have done it because, hey, after Matt Ryan, it got pretty scarce pretty quick there in that quarterback room. If you look at the guys that kind of went through there, Mariota, Ritter, these guys, they didn't get any production. So now they've got 2 quarterbacks, one older with a bad Achilles and one that's not as old, but is still old. I mean, Michael Penix may not become the starter until he's 28 years old, right? I mean, that's the truth behind the whole thing. When we look at this quarterback position, for the most part, it kind of shook out the way that we thought it was going to. I mean, I don't think it surprises anyone. Caleb Williams went number 1. It doesn't really surprise anybody that Jaden Daniels went number 2 to the Washington Commanders. From a fantasy perspective, you like Caleb Williams a little bit more than Jaden Daniels? Is that close, or could you maybe convince yourself one way or the other based on maybe the scoring of a fantasy league, maybe to go Daniels over Williams?
Yeah, no, I think it's really close. I think Jaden Daniels is going to be my rookie QB1 for redraft this year. It wouldn't shock me if Jaden Daniels beats him out in fantasy points per game in each of the next 3, 4, 5 years. Like, really wouldn't be a major shock. And that's just because of the potency of the Konami code, just like the upside and floor advantage a hypermobile quarterback has relative to his more statue-like peers. But at the end of the day, it's Caleb Williams, supposedly generational prospect. He's going to be throwing the ball to Keenan Allen, DJ Moore, Romo Dunze. It just seems like a near impossible to fail setup. So yeah, he's my QB1. He's my 101 in Superflex. Although I have it multiple times debated Jaden Daniels pre-draft or debated putting Marvin Harrison Jr., but that is ultimately what I settled on.
Yeah, I'm with you. In Dynasty, I'm not making the switch there. You gotta have Caleb Williams first. But in redraft, I've updated my rankings like yesterday and had Jaden Daniels ahead of Caleb Williams by several spots. And I felt like I was on an island there when I was looking at other people's rankings, and I was like, man, am I just really off on this? But I feel like if you're in redraft for the rookie season, if you're looking to find that player that is going to make that impact that you can pair up with a nice stable option and the high upside guy, I feel like Jaden Daniels has to be that guy from the rookie class over Caleb Williams.
Yeah, I'm with you. And it's like crazy the way people are talking about him, where it's like, all right, Richmond's RG3, maybe he could be Lamar Jackson as his upside, and then as his downside, it's like, well, he could be Justin Fields, where, you know, he doesn't last in the league very long. And it's like, those range of outcomes, like what you're telling me from a fantasy perspective, sounds awesome. Like RG3 at the time had the best fantasy QB rookie season ever. Lamar Jackson, I think the best fantasy season of all time on a per game basis in 2019. And then Justin Fields, you know, the guy was a mid-range QB1 every week he was on the field, and he sucked ass, right? So it's like, I'm pretty sure Jaden Daniels is better, much better real life quarterback than Justin Fields was, and he was so nice for fantasy. So just weighing those range of outcomes, that's a major leg up on a Caleb Williams. But then again, so is having that supporting cast that he has.
True.
I don't trust the Bears. I mean, they've given me no reason to trust that they can develop anybody. Mitch Trubisky, Justin Fields. I mean, at least they've kind of supported Caleb Williams ahead of time. I do like what the Commanders have done there with their wide receivers. I mean, Terry McLaurin is what he happens to be. Whether you like him or not, he's still a capable wide receiver. Jahan Dotson's still there. They got Sanat there in the draft. They got Austin Eckler, who catches the ball out of the backfield. I mean, he's got some nice options. I don't know, Scott, do you feel the same way that maybe Jaden Daniels is getting unfairly pigeonholed into that Konami quarterback? Yes, he has that running ability, but I think people forget the guy completed 72% of his passes, threw for 3,800 yards, casually threw 40 touchdowns. His deep ball completion rate was at 64%, 22 touchdowns on deep balls. Jaden Daniels isn't Justin Fields. He can throw the ball. I mean, he's not Mitch Trubisky. He could actually throw to both sides of the field, something that Trubisky could never do. So I feel like Jaden Daniels kind of gets pigeonholed into that Lamar Jackson, Randall Cunningham, RG3 type role, but the guy can throw the ball. And for me, I think he throws the ball just about as good as Caleb Williams and then gives you that rushing upside. So I got him as my QB1 in redraft. My QB1, as far as rookies are going, as far as Dynasty, again, anything can happen because there's always someone who's going to be a huge bust. I mean, we've got 6 quarterbacks taking the first 12 selections. There's going to be bust potential here all over. And it seems like every quarterback has a pair. Caleb Williams with Jaden Daniels. Then we also have J.J. McCarthy and Drake May. We heard the Minnesota Vikings were trying to potentially trade up to number 3, but J.J. McCarthy was always their guy. I mean, Scott, you do a great article, video type thing here every year where you sit down, lock yourself into a room with some Cheetos and some Bud Light, and you go through all the coach speak of all the press conferences and break it all down. It's one of my favorite pieces you do every single year because I got no time for that, but I love hearing your perspective on that. So when you hear the Minnesota Vikings say they got their guy the whole time in JJ McCarthy, but they wanted to trade up to number 3, do you still believe that JJ McCarthy was their guy for the Minnesota Vikings, or do you think maybe they're trying to get up there for Drake May? And how do you feel about both those quarterback prospects?
It's tough to say. It's like lying season, right? Like the Lions reached on Jahmyr Gibbs last year, and then the first thing that comes out is, oh, no, the Jets were going to take him if he didn't. And you always hear that with the biggest reaches. And, maybe New England is trying to put all this out there to make them feel better about the Drake May pick. I was having this conversation today, but I'm inclined to believe that the NFL had it as this sort of top 3 tier and then a fall off. So Chicago obviously had Caleb Williams 101, and it was never even close for them throughout the process. Washington said Jaden Daniels was their QB1. New England said, we liked all 3 guys, and obviously May was the pick. They kind of like played it close to the vest, and like, they were like, Joe Milton. Yeah, we were really excited about him. We told, obviously he knows we took this guy at 4, and it's a competition, and the best players. I'm like, this is so weird, but yeah, no, it was leaked that the Giants tried to trade up. It was leaked that the Vikings tried to trade up, and just nothing could shake New England from getting off of him at 3. And then with Penix, it seemed like, yeah, he was in that second tier after the top 3. But it was notable to me that like Jaden Daniels refused to meet with them. JJ McCarthy refused to meet with them. And so it might've just been like, that was kind of the only guy really. And then McCarthy, yeah, the presser for that was weird. They kind of just like talked about his character the whole time, like not a lot of the on-field stuff. And then the Knicks one, I guess, would be the strangest, where Todd McShay said recently, he was like, yeah, I talked to like at least a dozen people who work for a dozen different NFL teams, and every single one of them told me they had a backup caliber round 2 or later grade on Bo Nix. So it did seem like that was a bit of a reach. And like, that's kind of like the bulk of the research I do is for quarterbacks. Like I haven't found anything based on the analytics that makes me feel remotely good about building a model or determining what's predictive. Which I guess is notable because Denver kept talking about the analytics when they brought up Knicks, which were awesome. But it's like, again, I just don't think that's super predictive. So like, what do? Is I just go off of projected draft capital, and maybe internally I'll weight some of this where it's like, okay, all these teams try to trade up for May. So he looks a tier ahead of McCarthy and Knicks. And then I just factor in landing spot and I factor in rushing upside. And that's really the bulk of all I do with quarterbacks, just because I haven't found anything to be predictive with the analytics.
I want to go back to the all of the rumors around everybody trading up to that 3rd spot for Drake May. I found that very interesting, but the team that I found the most interesting was the Giants, because they were the team that were trying to trade up for Drake May. And they also had the opportunity to take JJ McCarthy when it came to their own pick, and they passed on that. So
right.
I was kind of buying the whole, like, they're super close and JJ McCarthy is kind of pushing towards that tier. He's not quite in it, but that right there, and the fact that Minnesota, combined with Minnesota trying to trade up to the 3rd as well, it's kind of making me feel like there, the gap there in the belief that people have in JJ McCarthy might not be that conviction that people were feeling pre-draft. And it's interesting because he's got a fantastic landing spot. I mean, you land with Justin Jefferson and TJ Hawkinson and Jordan Addison. What more could you physically want? So it's a fantastic opportunity and landing spot. But it kind of makes you wonder just how teams were actually viewing him.
Yeah. So, I mean, fantasypoints.com prospect guide written up by Brett Whitefield, the sharpest film mind I know, he had JJ McCarthy QB1. So he was convicted on him. To me, it really doesn't seem like the NFL was, for all the reasons we just outlined. But that doesn't mean he's not going to hit. NFL gets it wrong all the time. And like we just said, it's a great landing spot. I mean, Mitch Trubisky went 8 picks above Patrick Mahomes, and who went 2 picks above Deshaun Watson. All those guys should have been top 3 picks that year. But yeah, I think landing spot can go a massively long way. Like Kevin O'Connell was a QB guru, private coach, and then he was a quarterbacks coach, then an offensive play caller, then a head coach. The guy knows the position really well. He seems like a genius. That also looks like a nearly impossible to fail situation from an NFL perspective. You're throwing the ball to Jordan Addison, Justin Jefferson, TJ Hawkinson. And then from a fantasy perspective, Cousins started 7 games last year, and the rest were just like backups signed off the street who had no business playing in the NFL, and he led the league in passing yards. So like, that's an awesome spot for fantasy. And then it's the same thing with Bo Nix. Is like, maybe I'm a Sean Payton truther just because like, I love the guy. I love the guy's personality. He's a straight shooter, and he seems really smart. But he has a phenomenal track record throughout the NFL, dating back to like maybe Kerry Collins. But even from a fantasy perspective, you look at what he did with a 39, 40, 41-year-old Drew Brees, Taysom Hill, Teddy Bridgewater, Jameis Winston, a number of other backups, and they were all averaging low-end QB1 numbers. Even Russell Wilson last year, who I think has been cooked for 3 years now, ranked top 10 in fantasy points per dropback. So phenomenal landing spot for him, even if it very well could have been the case if Denver hadn't made that pick. He fell into round 2. It's just, that's a sick landing spot.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but when I heard the New England Patriots select Drake May, my heart dropped. I love Drake May, and I heard New England. I'm like, oh, here we go again. We're going to give him the McCorkle Jones treatment. You're going to kill my Drake May shares in fantasy. But I do like, and we'll talk about this here as we kind of transition into the wide receivers. I do like what they did as far as wide receivers are concerned, giving him some young talent to work with. I mean, that roster didn't really have a lot of wide receivers to begin with. Kendrick Bourne, Davis is there, Juju Smith-Schuster, whose knees are basically being held together with Hubba Bubba Bubblegum. And quite frankly, I'd rather take the Hubba Bubba Bubblegum over Juju Smith-Schuster any day of the week. But I do like what New England did to kind of give him some young weapons to grow with. So before we get into those weapons, those wide receivers, give me something about Bo Nix, because I do not like the guy. There's nothing about him that I've ever liked. I had to reluctantly put him ahead of Michael Penix in my rankings because of how it shook out. But I don't like Bo Nix. I mean, he's like the check down king. You watch that gimmicky offense in Oregon. And yes, he had big numbers out there, but it was a lot of check downs, a lot of screens, a lot of things that kind of push those numbers up. You watch what he did in Auburn, and there was nothing spectacular. Yes, he's a great athlete, but I can't get behind him. Scott, tell me something good about Bo Nix. Something.
Yeah, I'm sort of a nihilist when it comes to QB analytics, but the analytics are incredible. Something that really translates over the next level, and you heard Sean Payton say literally this in his press conference, perhaps hinting at the importance of pressure to sack, which is something we've talked about for a long time. It's a really good red flag stat, not necessarily a green flag stat. Quarterbacks who take sacks in college tend to take sacks in the pros. Sacks are massive drive killers. Every 2.5 sacks is 2 to 2.5 sacks is worth an interception. And people don't really think about it like that. You think about interceptions being so much worse, but really sacks are very close to being on par with interceptions. And so he threw no interceptions. He took 0 sacks, like very few negative plays, which a coach like Sean Payton's going to love. And so if you just look back over the last decade, right? All quarterback seasons where a quarterback took fewer than 7 sacks, threw fewer than 4 interceptions, and then you just rank them by passing touchdowns, Bo Nix last year had 45. Mac Jones had 14. So that's just like an insane season where you have the good of the touchdowns and then the bad with sacks and interceptions. And just so no one comes close to that. But you mentioned the screens. You mentioned the screen element. And so I think that's really important. And this is what I say all the time. This is what I do for wide receivers. And I don't think anyone else in the industry does this. But I remove screen production, or at least heavily de-weight it. I look at yards after the catch per reception minus screens over that stat raw. It's just not indicative of route running. You have a 98% expected catch rate on screens. So like, it's not obvious to me genuinely why we don't just count that as rushing production. And so, yeah, like the first thing you do when you evaluate a quarterback or wide receiver, wide receiver, maybe you look at it to see how dynamic they are after the catch. But for a quarterback, you just remove it. Sean Payton said that's what he did. We can't hold this against him because this is what the offense asked him to do, and he did it well. We took those out. We looked at all the other plays, and that's great. But so he has this reputation as a screen merchant. You know who has the exact same stats but has never had the reputation as a screen merchant? It's Patrick Mahomes. Like way more than Tom Brady. Tom Brady was never a screen merchant anywhere close to the degree that Patrick Mahomes is. And so I put this tweet out earlier today. Bo Nix in 2023, 18% or 20% of his yards came behind the line of scrimmage, 22% came deep. Patrick Mahomes last year, 17% of his yards came behind the line of scrimmage, 16% of his yards came deep. Basically the exact same. Bo Nix 2023 versus Patrick Mahomes, his final 2 years of college, it's the exact same thing. 22% of his yards coming deep versus Pat's 23%, 20% of his yards coming behind the line of scrimmage versus Pat's 18%. And so like stylistically, it's kind of the same thing. You really just can't hold that too much against him when it's just a function of the offense. And then it's also like you factor that in, the numbers were still crazy. I don't want to say they were Mahomes level good because I don't think they were, but it's still like incredible numbers. So again, I don't know how much this means to me, but that's just because like I don't care about QB stats that much.
I do have one more Bo Nix question before we move on. And I'm not going to drag Bo Nix because I've done that elsewhere and I won't continue.
Okay. I mean,
but you mentioned
the only team with a round one grade on him apparently. So
yeah, but you did mention in your model brother positions when you're looking at college and you're looking at conferences, you got the Big Ten and the SEC as the majors, and then other Power Five down there at AAA. Is there what is the concern? And because this is an issue that I have, what is the concern of a quarterback going from the SEC to the Pac-10? And we know the numbers that you put up in the SEC, and you were younger, so there's growth that can happen. But we know what you did against SEC defenses, and then you went over to the Pac-10 and you lit it up. Is any concern around there being just that natural transition to out of a team that is in the SEC?
I think really it's just player. So age adjusted whatever is so important with wide receivers. Doesn't really matter that much with running backs. Doesn't matter at all with tight ends. I don't think it matters nearly at all with quarterbacks. It just takes time. Joe Burrow, was a bench player before, really his breakout final season. Jaden Daniels would never have been drafted if he stayed at Arizona State, or at least would have been a late day 7 pick. And so you have Bo Nix, who, struggled at Auburn, although there's some film people who thought he was okay. But like what went into this, the guy played 5 seasons and he had 5 different offensive coordinators. That's really tough.
Yeah.
Especially on a young quarterback. Like we've been making that excuse for Daniel Jones, I don't know how many years. And I think this excuse is like way more warranted for a Bo Nix. But yeah, so he goes to the Pac and lights it up to like an insane degree. Like their average point differential was like 39.5. Like they were just smoking everyone. And that's another key point that kind of hurts him analytically, is like if you just remove the second half of games, he looks like even more impressive in comparison to everyone else, because it's like game's over at halftime. Same thing for JJ McCarthy as well, by the way. But yeah, I feel very confident in my running back model, my wide receiver, tight end, quarterback. Again, I'm a nihilist, but like these are cool, impressive stats to me. I just don't know how predictive they are.
All right. So, Tara, remember when I got roasted there? I think I've called Patrick Mahomes a game manager last season at one point on the show. So I did throw that out there, and I got eaten up there on social media. But you just proved my point with Patrick Mahomes. But you know what? We're not going to go there. The good thing with the Denver Broncos and Bo Nix, I think Javonte Williams and Samaje Perine basically combined for 97 targets. So we know that they're going to throw some screens. So that's another good thing there. And with Bo Nix, hey, a lot of people go to college for 7 years. Most of them are doctors, but a lot of people do go to college for 7 years. Now, let's talk about that wide receiver model. no Bo Nix dragging over here. We're all about pleasantries. Now, your wide receiver model, I find this interesting because there's two wide receivers at the very top that a lot of people have kind of settled on Marvin Harrison Jr. being that number one wide receiver. I'm not that guy. I still like Malik Neighbors. I love that. I have a certain type when it comes to wide receivers. I love the run after the catch. I love the yak ability. That's why I have Neighbors a little bit ahead of Marvin Harrison. I know you've got Harrison over Neighbors, and Odunze is right there too. I think if you ask NFL scouts and teams, there's teams that probably had each one of these wide receivers as their number one wide receiver in the draft. So when you look at these, who do you like the best as far as fantasy is concerned? I know Harrison looks like the guy there in Arizona. He's on pace for 130 plus targets already without even stepping on the field. But Malik Neighbors' competition is Wan'Dale Robinson.
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of people are viewing that as a negative, actually, where it's just like quarterback play is really bad. They haven't had a productive wide receiver in forever. But I'm with you. I see that as a good thing. Brian Dable, a former legendary wide receiver coach. And you look at the offense he likes to run. I think, Darren Waller just retired, by the way. They just have no one else. And so you have Malik Neighbors, who I think can be the Giants' true wide receiver one. But on top of that, basically do all of the Wan'Dale Robinson stuff Wan'Dale Robinson was doing, but at a much higher level than what Wan'Dale Robinson gave us. And so to me, that just screams massively high floor PPR cheat code potential. And then, legitimate wide receiver one upside beyond that. We didn't really get to see anything play out with Darren Waller. He was injured a few weeks before the season started, was never healthy. But all accounts from training camp, and this is why I was so high on Darren Waller last year, which didn't work out, was in training camp. I think Dan Duggan from The Athletic was tracking target share, and it was like 50% of the time Darren Waller was targeted. No one else was above like 10%. And then you saw that in preseason. You saw that, I guess, for the 50% route share Darren Waller had week one or before his next injury. And so I think there's a chance Daniel Jones just like absolutely locks onto him. So you might be right. I will just say, I think Arizona is an awesome landing spot as well. What do they need? They need an elite man beater outside wide receiver one. And that's what he gives you. Arizona was one of the worst offenses in football last year against man coverage. I think like Rondale Moore and Michael Wilson combined for like a 0.05 yards per route run against man coverage. It was so bad. So he could step in, best man beater in the class, immediately serve that role. Extremely NFL ready receiver. And Trey McBride eats against zone in the middle of the field. And that's a deadly combination. But I mean, I don't think you're wrong. It's close. But ultimately just based on the prospect score Marvin Harrison Jr. had, plus the better draft capital, he comes out ahead for me in dynasty leagues. Redraft, that might be something I have to give more thought to, but I think what I'll have is Harrison higher, but maybe Malik the better value.
Yeah, I don't think you go wrong with either one, to be honest with you. I mean, I think this is one of those drafts where you could have gone either way at the quarterback position, Williams or Daniels. I think you could have done the same thing at the wide receiver position with Neighbors or Harrison Jr. I think everyone kind of agrees that Rome Odunze is that number 3 wide receiver. But when you look at this, and this was kind of interesting, there's a little bit of a shakeup from the model versus the rankings here. When we look at guys like Ladd McConkey, Xavier Worthy, all the way down to, I think, Keon Coleman. So we had some movers and some shakers there as far as that's kind of concerned. Now, Brian Thomas dropped a little bit there as well from your model versus your rankings. Just kind of talk about how that tier of wide receivers, I do view those guys all in that same tier, and you could probably make a case to interchange them throughout.
Sorry, what was that? My Discord's going crazy. Yeah, the struggle of balancing CEO and content obligations. Sorry, guys. That's the second time I did that to you. My bad.
No worries. I'm just talking about that next tier of wide receivers, that Brian Thomas, McConkey, Worthy, and then you kind of throw in Keon Coleman in there, who definitely jumped up some spots there as far as the model's concerned versus the rankings. So one of the things I noticed right away when I look at this, Brian Thomas went from about number 4 on the model. He kind of dropped down a little bit in the rankings, where Keon Coleman took the opposite with that draft capital going to Buffalo. Just kind of talk about how that tier shakes out.
Right.
And then when you look at this, because I don't see any of those top 3 wide receivers being a bust, but one of those tweets that you recently put out was bust potential at the wide receiver position and the predictability of that. Do you see one of these guys maybe as more of a high risk fantasy asset?
Well, this is what I've been saying all offseason. Is just this class looks massively overrated from an analytics perspective, or at least it's one riddled with red flags, many of which might just be totally damning, might just be death knell stats rather than red flag stats. So you have the big 3, they're all guaranteed studs. I try and trade up for them. They're awesome. Love them. But then after that, it gets murky. I have Xavier Worthy as my next wide receiver, just because, I was worried about landing spot with him. So he was lower pre-draft, and then he just went to the ultimate landing spot. I worried with his size, he wouldn't go to a smart, forward-thinking offensive coordinator who uses motion, and then he went to like one of the best. I do still worry with Kansas City that they're going to do that stupid wide receiver committee where like no one has above a 60% route share. Like that's keeping me up at night, but I'm hoping they just come to their senses and do what's right. And then I have Lackey. I think that's an awesome landing spot. Just, so many vacated targets. And it was a player I really liked. Then there's a teardrop and you get to Brian Thomas Jr. Draft capital helped him here, but to me, he's really just like a one-trick pony, deep threat only type, at least at this stage of his career. Maybe he can develop into something more. He's freakish athleticism, but also just based on the offense, that's probably how they want to use him. Doug Peterson wide receivers have always underwhelmed for fantasy. Tight ends have exceeded expectations. And then Christian Kirk, a slot, exceeded expectations, let's say, but they did give him like a top 5 contract at the time. After that, within that tier, there's Keon Coleman, a player I was not that high on, but I mean, amazing landing spot. No more Stephon Diggs, no Gabe Davis, Josh Allen throwing to you. Hard to fail in that situation. And then Ricky Pearsall, Brett's guy, Brett's wide receiver 5 pre-draft, just based on the film. And then Xavier Legette and Jermaine Burton. Legette, the round 1 draft capital helped him, but he was a player I really struggled with weighing pros and cons. Like some of the stuff, like the age and the super late breakout might just be totally disqualifying. But I sort of, in spite of myself, I'm like, I shouldn't do this based on everything I just wrote, but I still kind of like him. I still kind of see the upside. And then Jermaine Burton was the last within that tier. Lower draft capital, but supposedly off the field issues, which might play a role in that. T. Higgins likely to leave after this year, catching passes from Joe Burrow. That's pretty nice.
Yeah, I really want to. I don't want to touch too much onto it, but I really wanted to kind of mention that Jermaine Burton replacing T. Higgins more than likely next season type situation. We've also got that situation for Ricky Pearsall there as well, because we have heard those rumors of Debo and or Brandon Ayuk possibly leaving San Francisco, which would definitely be a huge boost for Pearsall's production as far as that's concerned. For me, Tara, I don't know if you guys caught this on Twitter, but I may have made a comment out there about my boy Jalen McMillan being the next Puka Nacua. I might have thrown that out there. And it wasn't because he's going to have 1,500 receiving yards. It was because I felt that he was being underrated. He was being overshadowed by Odunze. He was being overshadowed by Jalen Polk, who went to New England along with Javon Baker there for giving Drake May some options there. But I really do like Jalen McMillan as that big slot there in Tampa Bay. I know Chris Godwin's there. We know Mike Evans is there. They're both getting a little bit older. Something about Jalen McMillan I really like about his game. I like his production. I know he was hurt last season, which hurt him. And hey, we are about what have you done for me lately. So we didn't see him on the field. He took a little bit of a hit there as far as fantasy is concerned. But he's one of those guys that I really like. And I don't know if the analytics kind of match that. But Scott, just kind of talk about Jalen McMillan, if you would, for just a second.
Yeah, so I really like him too. The Puka Nacua comp is really interesting. JG Zachariason had a great one. I don't know if he said this publicly or just to me in DMs. Hopefully he doesn't get mad at me, but he was saying he could see him being Amon-Ra St. Brown, where, that USC offense is a lot like this Washington offense. And I really see it with McMillan. Like I had a much higher ranking on him than Polk, just because whenever he was healthy, he was always the clear wide receiver too. I will say, he was slot only in college, which is a concern, injects some uncertainty in the equation. You do have to devalue slot production and blah, blah, blah. And also the landing spot too. I haven't looked at it yet, but I saw a tweet from Ryan Heath. He put something out on this, but how often are they going to be in 3 wide receiver sets? That's going to be really important to him because, again, especially with those 2 stud wide receivers. But I just, from recollection last year, Trey Palmer was, somewhere between like 50 and 66% snap share. And I see McMillan as a huge upgrade on that. And, Godwin, his play really slipped off last year. He's dealt with a bunch of injuries. Maybe they have plans for him beyond this year. And so, yeah, this is a player I like as well, player I'm higher on relative to consensus. So I think that's a good call. It's hard to get a good read on him just with that insanely stacked Washington offense, all the target competition, but his numbers were great. His numbers were much better than, I guess, projected draft or than draft capital implied.
All right, Scott, biggest bust potential amongst the wide receivers. Who is the buyer beware for fantasy? He might not bust, but who's that guy you're like, you know what, I'm going to let someone else take him right now?
I'd say it's either Leggett or Adonai Mitchell. The flip side with Leggett, though, is like the upside's awesome. Like he was just like the ultimate, like really high. Like he might have the 4th best wide receiver 1 upside in the class. Like that's possible. Firmly within the range of outcomes, but also like maybe the most likely of any day 1, day 2 wide receiver to bust. And then Adonai Mitchell, just like there's some nuance there, some things muddying his profile, but it was like easily the worst analytics profile of the day 1, day 2 guys. I'll say, those would be mine of the early drafted guys.
I want to ask about Brian Thomas real quick, because I'm mid rookie draft and Brian Thomas was wide receiver 4 off the board, and I've seen that happening a lot. And in your rankings, he's obviously further back here. And I feel like Brian Thomas is an interesting one because when he went to Jacksonville, obviously draft capital, big thing, but a lot of people saw that landing spot and got super excited. And I'm kind of looking here and I don't feel super comfortable with taking him as if that was my pick and it was wide receiver 4 off the board. I don't know. I don't think I could do it because I don't feel super comfortable with it because I feel like the landing spot is a little bit deceiving. I know people want to write off Christian Kirk, but when you look at the stats last year, for games where he and Ridley were together, he outperformed Ridley. He was the more reliable, the higher targeted receiver. Higher fantasy points. And when you're looking at that and saying, okay, we're getting Brian Thomas in here, going to replace Ridley. Is he going to be the wide receiver 1 of that offense? Is he worthy of where he's being drafted? Yeah, that's one that concerns me a wee bit.
No, that's exactly what I'm saying is that was my concern with Calvin Ridley. And everyone was just like, oh no, don't worry about it. It's Calvin Ridley. He's a stud. He's awesome. But it's just Doug Peterson's offense, like, just doesn't seem like wide receivers are all that important or valuable. Like, horrible track record with wide receivers, like some really high level talents who have just underwhelmed with Peterson. And like, what even was Calvin Ridley doing? It just seemed like he was playing like the clear out role, and the production wasn't there. It was a super underwhelming season. And those are all my concerns. And like, what is Brian Thomas Jr. analytically? He's a player who only had one good season, and 50% of his yards came on one route, which was the go route last year. He was elite at it. Okay, so he's an elite deep threat, but what does that mean for fantasy? It's like every single elite deep threat is, and who's only elite at that, is a better in real life player than fantasy player. The targets or receptions are so valuable in PPR leagues. And then their production is more volatile week to week. So it's harder to predict. It hurts you in a start sit league. And now with the rise of the too high era, maybe that just doesn't matter as much. And so these are all the concerns I have. And ultimately, like, when I'm on the clock and the next player by ADP is Brian Thomas Jr., I'm going to be trying to trade down because I know there are a lot of people super high on him, and it's just, I can't get there.
Completely agree.
Straight up. Speaking of concerns, rapid fire here, tight end edition. Are you concerned about Brock Bowers' landing spot with the Las Vegas Raiders?
Yeah, I mean, it's just like there were like 7 landing spots that would have just totally sucked, and he went to one of those, and I didn't think any of those were possible. At the end of the day, you never want to be betting against an uber freak elite talent. I had him as no worse than the second best tight end prospect in a decade. And so I'm going to stay true to my board on that and just trust the talent. So ultimately I didn't penalize him too much. I think he's still my 104 in one QB leagues, but it's definitely unideal. Maybe they trade Michael Mayer or something, but just the track record on teams with 2 tight ends who get like 40 or more targets, it just doesn't work out. Even if one of them is super elite and one of them is only okay, it's just they cannibalize each other's production. Quarterback play is a concern. Devontae Adams is going to get 150 plus targets. And so just really not great, but in a dynasty league, ideally you're holding these guys for forever. And so I really just have to kind of bank on the talent with him.
Let's call it the way it is. Everyone's calling for 12 personnel there in Las Vegas. Brock Bowers isn't a tight end. He's really a slot wide receiver. So they're not even going to have to run 12 personnel. It'll be 3 wide receivers. That's how that's going to go.
So I love that. I love that. The issue is it just like never really happens. Like, last year they were all saying that about Dalton Kincaid, but you look at his splits with and without Dawson Knox, and they were so dramatic. I think over the past like 8 years, there's only been like 2 guys to average more than a 60% slot share. And it was like Mike Gesicki and Mark Andrews. But I don't know. Like I said, Brock Bowers is such a freak. Like he could do anything and it wouldn't surprise me.
All right. And last thing here, biggest riser, biggest faller. When I look at your model versus your rankings, Jaheim Bell, he take a huge drop there. Model, I think he's your number 2. He take a huge hit there when it came to the rankings. Meanwhile, Ben Sinnott, he rose up from number 5 in the model to number 2 as far as the tight ends are concerned. What was the difference between them, other than, obviously draft capital played a huge role in Bell's drop, his fall from grace, if I will.
Yeah, our subscribers are going to hate to hear this, but like I expect my rankings to change a lot once I work my way through my post-draft presser review. And like Sinnott is someone who could, like you just said, tight end 2 to me, and like that could scare me. A lot of that is obviously like amazing draft capital, but this is a tight end who won the Low Man Trophy last year, which is the award given to the best fullback. And so it's like if they just invoke the name Kyle Juszczyk, like he's plummeting down, or Josiah DeGuara, he's plummeting down in my rankings. And then Jaheim Bell, that was just, that was just a horrible miss by me. And I'm not perfect. I make mistakes. And I think what happened there, and this is what usually happens with my biggest misses, is I weigh the pros and cons, right? And there's all these cons many of which I think ultimately were just totally disqualifying. It was a very low projected draft capital. The undersized thing didn't bother me too much, but like Sinnott, 2 years ago, he had more rushing yards than receiving yards. He was basically used like a running back or a fullback, and he's had the most screens of any tight end ever drafted. There's like 4 other stats like that, which I think at the end of the day is just totally disqualifying. The problem is like the upside stats were all just equally insane. It's like everything that's important and predictive to me. Third best in 5 years in career yards per route run, best ever single season yards per route run, best ever by yards after the catch per reception, and missed tackles forced per reception. I don't know. Amazing in line, in the slot, out wide, and out of the backfield, and like all these different things. And so that's just kind of what happens sometimes, is I can fall too in love with the upside argument and not appropriately value the downside. And that's just tricky. There's no model for that really. What do you do with a guy who like ranks first ranks 99th percentile in career yards per route run, but like played a season as a running back 2 years ago? And so, yeah, I mean, I'm still obviously rooting he breaks out, but I'm just telling you, the odds are massively stacked against a round 7 pick who doesn't contribute on special teams.
We like when the odds are stacked against us here on the Dynasty Vipers Vipercast. Scott, thank you again for joining the show here. What's going on next over at fantasypoints.com? Because I know content is just heating up over there. I know there's a whole new Dynasty approach that we got going on with fantasypoints.com. What do we got going on?
Yeah, well, I just wrote over 50% of the length of the catcher in the rye by word count in terms of my rookie models. I'd suggest checking those out. If you have any interest, or if you just trust me, you can check out my rankings, and then I'll do the post-draft press review. I'm still watching every presser from every single team and as much other background as possible, players getting calls on draft night or one-on-one interviews with the player. I really enjoy that. That's a lot of fun. But then after that, I'm probably going to take a couple of weeks off. Ryan Heath is doing excellent work digging into the most predictive, most important, the dankest stats that we have to offer in the Fantasy Points data suite. Graham Barfield is now our best ball czar. Check out his show with Hilo, doing some best ball mania, and check out our best ball rankings. And I don't know, we've got a bunch of stuff. We're going crazy over here at Fantasy Points, as you know.
Everything and anything over at fantasypoints.com. With that said, this has been the Vipercast, and we will see you next week. Take care.